Ewan stepped toward the sidewalk, Ryan commanded, his hand resting on his belt near his holstered firearm. Mark complied, his expression measured, his movements deliberate. As he stepped onto the curb, his stature seemed to shift suddenly, not in intimidation, but in assurance. His eyes stayed locked on Ryan, his demeanor an unspoken challenge to the officer's ungrounded suspicions. "Is there a problem, officer?" Mark asked, his voice steady yet tinged with the weight of restrained exasperation. Ryan hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Routine check," he replied brusquely. His eyes scanned Mark from head to toe, searching for anything to justify his actions. But there was nothing. No bulge of concealed weapons, no signs of contraband, nothing that screamed danger or illegality. Danny, standing by the patrol car, watched the scene unfold with growing unease. He had partnered with Ryan long enough to know the older officer's methods and biases, even if they were rarely acknowledged outright. Danny had heard the rumors among colleagues about Ryan's sixth sense, leading him to make questionable stops, but witnessing it firsthand stirred a gnawing discomfort. "Officer Whitman," Danny ventured cautiously, stepping closer. "Everything's clean. Maybe we should—" "Stay back, Danny," Ryan interrupted sharply, his tone brooking no dissent. He turned his attention back to Mark, who stood calmly under scrutiny. "Do you mind telling me why you pulled me over?" Mark asked, his tone polite but firm. Ryan shifted, the question momentarily throwing him off balance. "Like I said, routine check. This area has seen some activity lately." "Activity?" Mark echoed, his brow arching slightly. "And you assumed I was part of it because I'm driving an expensive car?" Ryan stiffened. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," Mark replied evenly. His calmness was a stark contrast to the tension emanating from Ryan. Danny watched the exchange, the weight of unease settling heavier on his shoulders. The man before them didn't appear agitated or aggressive. Instead, he carried himself with a poised confidence that unsettled Ryan more than outright defiance might have. Ryan cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Look, sir, we can make this easy. Just answer my questions, and if everything checks out, you'll be on your way." Mark's lips twitched into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "You already have everything you need, officer. My license, registration, and the knowledge that my car is legally mine. What more do you need?" Ryan's frustration mounted. His gut, his once trusted guide, was failing him. He couldn't let this end without proving his suspicions were valid. "Step back to the front of my car," he ordered, his voice a little louder this time. Mark's gaze didn't waver. Slowly, deliberately, he moved as instructed, his hand still in view. Just as Ryan began to speak, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb behind the patrol car. The door opened, and a man in a tailored suit stepped out, his expression a mixture of urgency and authority. "Officer," the man called out, walking toward them with purposeful strides. Ryan turned, his hand instinctively tightening on his belt. "And you are?" Ryan asked, his voice clipped. "I'm Deputy Chief Anderson," the man said, pulling out a badge and holding it up for both officers to see. "Is there a reason you're detaining the Attorney General of this state?" The words hit Ryan like a thunderclap. He froze, his eyes darting between Anderson and Mark. Danny's jaw dropped slightly, his gaze snapping to the man they'd stopped. Mark folded his arms across his chest, his expression neutral but tinged with a quiet vindication. "I was wondering how long it would take someone to recognize me," he said, his tone calm but pointed. Ryan's mind raced, the implications crashing down around him. The Attorney General, the top law enforcement officer in the state. He had no idea. "I wasn't aware," Ryan stammered, his face flushing. "I didn't mean—" "Didn't mean what?" Mark cut in, his voice still calm but laced with steel. "Didn't mean to stop someone driving a nice car in this neighborhood? Didn't mean to act on a hunch rather than fact?" Anderson stepped closer, his eyes boring into Ryan. "You do realize the gravity of this, Officer Whitman. You stopped a man without probable cause, detained him, and escalated without justification. This isn't just bad policing. It's profiling." Ryan opened his mouth to defend himself, but no words came. The weight of his actions settled heavily on his shoulders, and for the first time he couldn't hide behind his instincts or dismiss the uncomfortable truths staring him in the face. Mark stepped forward, his composed demeanor unshaken. "I'll be filing a formal complaint," he said, his voice steady. "Not just about this incident, but about the systemic issues it represents. Change starts somewhere, and it's long overdue." Anderson nodded, turning to Ryan. "You'll be hearing from Internal Affairs. This isn't going away quietly." Danny shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking to Ryan, whose face had turned a deep shade of red. Mark retrieved his license and registration from Danny, offering a curt nod of thanks before stepping back into his car. As the red Mercedes pulled away, Ryan stood frozen, the reality of what had just transpired crashing down on him. This wasn't just another stop. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Something that would force him to confront not only his actions, but the very system he represented. Occupant stepped out, a sharply dressed man in his 50s with a commanding presence. He adjusted his tie and approached with a measured stride, exuding confidence and authority. Ryan turned, his brow furrowing at the sight of the new arrival. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone sharp, though a hint of unease crept into his voice. The man ignored the question, his focus entirely on Mark. "Mr. Adams?" he said, offering a firm nod of acknowledgement. Mark returned the nod, his calm composure remaining unshaken. "Good evening, Mr. Collins," he replied evenly. Ryan's eyes darted between the two men, suspicion mingling with confusion. "Who are you?" he demanded, his grip tightening on his belt. The man finally turned to Ryan, his expression a blend of patience and quiet authority. "My name is Nathan Collins," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm the State Attorney General's Chief of Staff. Mr. Adams here is my superior." Ryan froze, his mind struggling to process the information. His mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. Mark crossed his arms, his expression steady. "I believe we're done here, officer," he said, his voice carrying a subtle but unmistakable weight. Ryan swallowed hard, his authority crumbling under the weight of the revelation. I was just conducting a routine stop," he stammered, the defensiveness in his tone betraying his discomfort. "Routine?" Collins echoed, raising an eyebrow. "It seems to me this went far beyond that. Tell me, officer, did you have any probable cause for stopping the Attorney General of this state?" Ryan's face flushed. I thought," he began, but the words faltered. He felt the weight of Mark's calm, unwavering gaze and the silent judgment in Collins's piercing stare. The woman with the phone continued recording, her expression one of quiet satisfaction as the dynamic of the encounter shifted. Mark stepped forward slightly, his posture unyielding yet composed. "Officer, this isn't about me," he said, his voice measured. "It's about the way you see people and the assumptions you make. I hope you'll reflect on that." Brandon said. Ryan's breath hitched, the words striking deeper than he cared to admit. He glanced at Danny, whose expression conveyed a mix of discomfort and quiet agreement. Collins pulled a card from his pocket and handed it to Ryan. "If you have any further questions, you can direct them to my office," he said firmly. "But I suggest you think carefully about how this incident reflects on you and your department." Ryan took the card with a trembling hand, his gaze falling to the ground. Mark turned to the woman with the phone and offered her a small nod of gratitude. Then, without another word, he walked back to his car. Collins followed, opening the door for him before returning to the SUV. The vehicle started up smoothly, the hum of their engines punctuating the silence as they pulled away, leaving Ryan standing by his patrol car, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. Danny approached hesitantly, his voice low. "Officer, maybe it's time we reevaluate how we handle situations like this," he said cautiously. Ryan didn't respond. He stared down the empty street, his jaw tightening as the echoes of Mark's words lingered in his mind. A smile replaced with a composed, serious expression. "Thank you, Director Hastings," he said evenly. "I trust you'll ensure justice is served." Hastings gave a sharp nod before turning her attention back to Ryan, her piercing gaze unwavering. "You've not only embarrassed yourself, but have also tarnished the reputation of this department. I hope you understand the gravity of your actions." Ryan tried to form a response, but his throat felt dry and words failed him. His mind raced with regret and dread, knowing there was no undoing the choices he had made. The woman recording the scene took a step closer, her phone steady as it captured every detail. The weight of her presence, coupled with Hastings's authority, left no room for ambiguity. This was accountability in action. Mark adjusted his suit, his movements calm and deliberate, and glanced toward Danny. The younger officer's discomfort was evident, his eyes fixed on the ground, shoulders slumped. Mark's expression softened momentarily, as though silently acknowledging the internal conflict Danny was experiencing. Without another word, Hastings gestured toward her SUV, signaling to Mark. He moved toward it with measured steps, pausing briefly to nod once more at the woman still filming. "Thank you," he said softly, his tone carrying a depth of gratitude. As Mark entered the vehicle and Hastings returned to the driver's side, she cast one final glance at Ryan. "Remember this moment, Officer Whitman," she said, her voice low but carrying immense weight. "It will define your career, if it still exists after this." The SUV's engine purred to life, and with a smooth turn, it disappeared down the street, leaving Ryan standing in stunned silence. Danny shifted awkwardly, stealing a glance at his partner before looking away again, unable to hide his unease. The woman with the phone finally lowered it, her job done. She gave Ryan a look that was equal parts pity and disdain before turning and walking away, her footsteps echoing softly in the tense quiet. Ryan remained rooted in place, the weight of his actions pressing down like an iron shroud. The patrol car loomed behind him, its flashing lights now feeling like a mockery of his authority. Ryan sat at his desk, the oppressive weight of regret settling heavier with each passing minute. The shattered silence from his phone's abrupt ringing had jostled him, but he ignored the unfamiliar number glaring on the screen. Laura's sharp gaze, colder than the winter wind, bore into him. "That's probably the press," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Or worse, your colleagues, wondering what on earth you were thinking." Ryan sighed deeply, retreating to his office and closing the door behind him. The solitude offered little comfort. Instead, it amplified the cacophony of his thoughts. No matter how much he wanted to rewind the clock, the damage was done. Sitting heavily in his chair, he stared at the family photo on his desk. A snapshot from a happy weekend trip. In it, he, Laura, and their 2 children were all smiles under the warm sun. That joy felt like a relic from another lifetime, a world where his integrity hadn't crumbled under the weight of his actions. "How did it come to this?" he whispered to no one, his voice tinged with despair. He knew regret wasn't enough, but the courage to face the consequences, to publicly own his mistakes, felt impossibly out of reach. Outside, the chants of protesters filtered through the thin walls. Phrases like "justice for all" and "end racial profiling" striking him like hammer blows. Their voices carried a truth he could no longer deny, echoing in his mind as he wrestled with the question that haunted him. Could he ever make amends? Meanwhile, across the city, Mark Adams stepped onto the stage of a grand auditorium, the air buzzing with anticipation. Reporters, activists, and legal officials packed the room, eager to hear the Attorney General speak. Silence descended as Mark approached the podium, adjusting the microphone with practiced ease. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice steady yet resonant. "The incident that occurred is not just about me. It is emblematic of deeper systemic issues we can no longer ignore." Every eye was fixed on him, the weight of his words palpable in the still air. "As Attorney General, I have the privilege and platform to defend myself," Mark continued. "But what happens when someone doesn't have this position? What happens when it's a person without power, without a voice to protect themselves? How many people have endured the same treatment but were never heard?" His questions lingered in the room, striking a chord with everyone present. He paused, his gaze distant, as if recalling a memory that still stung. "Before I held this position," he said, "I was just another black man navigating a society steeped in prejudice. I've faced skeptical stares, unnecessary questions, and even outright injustice simply because I didn't fit someone's narrow perception of who I was supposed to be." Mark's voice softened as he shared a personal story from his past, a moment when he had been stopped by police as a young law student driving his father's old car. The memory was vivid, the accusatory questions, the baseless search of his vehicle, and the humiliation that lingered long after the incident ended. "That night I returned home filled with anger and shame," Mark said. "It wasn't the first time and it wasn't the last. Those experiences taught me one harsh truth. Sometimes, just because of how you look, you have to work twice as hard to be treated as human." The room hung on his every word as he raised his voice, his determination unwavering. "That's why I went into law. That's why I fight. And that's why I won't stay silent about what happened. This is not about one person or one incident. It's about a system that has allowed prejudice to infiltrate its operations. It's time we stop talking about change and start making it happen." The applause that followed was thunderous, a wave of emotion surging through the crowd. But Mark wasn't finished. Looking directly into the cameras, he delivered his final message with the weight of conviction. "I call on everyone who has ever suffered injustice, everyone who has ever been silenced or overlooked, stand up. None of us can fix this system alone, but together we can. This is not the fight of one person, it is the fight of us all." As Mark stepped down from the podium, the crowd rose to their feet, their applause echoing through the auditorium like a clarion call for justice. The incident that had shaken the nation would not fade into obscurity. Instead, it would become the catalyst for a movement, a chance to build a better, fairer future. Elsewhere, Danny Hayes wrestled with his own conscience. The events of that day replayed endlessly in his mind. Ryan's loss of control, Mark's composed yet unyielding presence, and Director Hastings' decisive intervention. The weight of it all left him torn between his loyalty to the police force and the growing awareness of the system's flaws. Late one evening, Danny sat at his kitchen table, his police badge lying before him like a relic of a life he no longer recognized. Emily, his wife, entered the room and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Danny, are you okay? You've been like this for days." "What's wrong?" Fellini looked up, his immediate scrutiny slightly tilted downward. Danny sighed, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I don't know if I can keep doing this job anymore," he admitted. When Emily asked why, he poured out his heart, confessing the guilt that had consumed him. "I stood there and saw everything Ryan did. I knew it was wrong, but I stayed silent. I was scared of losing everything, but now I realize my silence made me complicit." Emily squeezed his hand. "You're a good man, Danny, but if this job makes you feel like you're betraying yourself, maybe it's time to make a change." The next day, Danny made his decision. He walked into the station and submitted his resignation, leaving behind the badge that had once symbolized his commitment to justice. Though uncertain of what lay ahead, he felt a sense of relief, knowing he could no longer be part of a system that conflicted with his values. In the days that followed, Danny found a new sense of purpose. He began researching organizations dedicated to police reform, realizing that his experience could be a powerful tool for change. One morning, as he sat reading about a nonprofit called Justice First, Emily placed a cup of coffee in front of him. "Find something?" she asked. Danny nodded, a spark of determination lighting his eyes. "There's this organization, Justice First, the organization dedicated to supporting victims of injustice and advocating systemic reform, became Danny's beacon of hope. "I think this might be where I can start," he told Emily one evening, his voice laced with tentative optimism. She smiled warmly, her encouragement unwavering. "Then do it, Danny. This could be your chance to make things right and do something meaningful." Shortly after, Danny joined Justice First. In his first weeks, he immersed himself in their training programs, attending workshops and listening intently to the stories of people who had suffered under systemic injustices. Each testimony deepened his understanding of the problem and strengthened his resolve. It was as if the blinders he had unknowingly worn for years were finally being removed, revealing the breadth and depth of the systemic issues he had been a part of. One evening, after a particularly intense day of workshops, Danny returned home. As he sank into the couch beside Emily, a faint smile played on his lips, his eyes gleaming with a newfound sense of purpose. "Today, I told my story," he shared, his voice tinged with both vulnerability and pride. "I talked about why I left the force and why I joined Justice First. You know what one of the participants said? They told me that my story gave them hope. They said if a police officer could acknowledge the need for change, maybe we really can make a difference." Emily reached over and squeezed his hand, her smile widening. "You've found your path, Danny. I'm so proud of you." Relief washed over Danny, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. While he no longer wore the badge, he realized he had stepped into a new role, one that was even more meaningful. The road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, but he was ready to face it, knowing he was no longer part of the problem, but part of the solution. While Danny embarked on this new chapter, Ryan Whitman faced a vastly different reality. The footage from his body camera, combined with the bystander video, continued to dominate national headlines, sparking widespread outrage. The internal investigation into Ryan's conduct was swift and unrelenting. Each piece of evidence, his words, actions, and prejudiced demeanor, painted a damning picture. Ryan was summoned to a final hearing at the police department, seated in a stark conference room facing the Internal Review Board, his superiors, and an attorney. The colleagues who once regarded him with camaraderie now looked at him with disappointment and disdain. His superior's words were cold and final. "The investigation has concluded that your conduct severely violated the code of ethics of this department. Ryan Whitman, you are hereby terminated immediately and deemed ineligible to serve in any law enforcement capacity in the future." The weight of guilt crushed Ryan's shoulders as he hung his head. When the hearing ended, he quietly packed his belongings. The office he had once taken pride in, now reduced to an empty shell. A few days later, as he sat at his kitchen table, typing out job applications he suspected would go unanswered, an envelope arrived in the mail. The sender was Mark Adams. He hesitated. Ryan opened it, bracing for harsh criticism from the man he had wronged. Instead, he found words of unexpected grace. "Ryan," the letter began, the tone calm and forgiving, "I am not writing this letter to condemn you. I understand you are facing severe consequences for your actions, and I hope they provide an opportunity for reflection. I believe people are not inherently bad, but are often shaped by biases and environments we fail to recognize. Think about why you chose this path in the first place. You once aspired to protect and serve your community. To truly achieve that, you must understand that justice is rooted in respect, not judgment. If you are willing to change, you can still contribute positively to society. Learn to re-examine everything, and do not let this mistake define you. I hope you find your way. Sincerely, Mark Adams." Ryan read the letter again and again, each word resonating deeply. For the first time in weeks, he felt something he hadn't dared to hope for: the possibility of redemption. Motivated by Mark's words, Ryan enrolled in a rehabilitation program designed for former officers accused of misconduct. The program focused on addressing implicit biases and rebuilding trust with the communities they had wronged. During one group session, Ryan found the courage to voice the truths he had long suppressed. "I let my biases dictate my actions," he admitted, his voice low but steady. "I didn't realize I was hurting people, and I didn't want to see it." The weight of those words, spoken aloud, marked the beginning of his journey towards self-awareness and accountability. Career, but also erode the trust that the public places in law enforcement. Hastings's voice was firm, unwavering, and carried a weight that made Ryan shrink further into himself. "This isn't just about you, Officer Whitman. It's about every officer who wears this badge and the example you've set today." Ryan's face reddened with a mix of shame and defiance. I didn't mean for it to escalate like this," he muttered, but the excuse felt hollow even to him. Mark stood near his car, watching the scene unfold. His calm demeanor had returned, but there was a deep sadness in his eyes. A sadness born from the repetition of these situations, from the need for such confrontations in the first place. Hastings turned her attention back to Danny. "Officer Hayes," she said, her voice softer but still firm, "you have an opportunity here. You can either uphold the principles of justice or allow fear to dictate your actions. The choice is yours." Danny's grip on the tablet tightened as he glanced at Mark, then back at Hastings. His throat felt dry, and the words caught, but he managed to speak. "Director Hastings," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, I believe we should have handled this differently." Ryan shot him a glare, his voice rising. "Differently? What does that even mean? You're throwing me under the bus?" Hastings raised a hand, silencing Ryan once more. "Enough," she said sharply. Turning to Danny, she nodded, acknowledging his courage. "It's not easy to speak up, Officer Hayes, but accountability starts here, with each of us. Remember that." The woman with the phone continued to record, her presence a silent reminder of the scrutiny that now enveloped the scene. Hastings met her gaze briefly, giving a subtle nod, as if to say, "This matters. Keep recording." Ryan's shoulders slumped, his authority stripped bare. He opened his mouth to speak, but found no words that could salvage the situation. The realization hit him like a wave. There was no escaping the consequences this time. Ryan shook his head. Hastings exhaled sharply, pulling out her phone again. "Internal Affairs will be here shortly to take over. You'll provide a full account of your actions, Officer Whitman, and know this incident will not be buried or forgotten." As she ended the call, Hastings turned to Mark. "Again, I deeply regret what happened here. This isn't just about holding individuals accountable. It's about rebuilding trust and ensuring this system works for everyone." Mark gave a small nod. "Thank you, Director Hastings. I appreciate your commitment to that." His tone was measured, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had been through this too many times before. Hastings nodded in return, her expression a mix of determination and regret. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked toward her SUV, her presence as commanding as ever. The tension in the air lingered even as the sound of her vehicle faded into the distance. Ryan stood frozen, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. Danny remained still, his gaze fixed on the ground, the tablet clutched tightly in his hands. Mark, meanwhile, took a steady breath and climbed into his car, his composure intact, but his heart heavy. Pierced the tense silence in the room, snapping Ryan out of his spiraling thoughts. He hesitated before picking it up, seeing the caller ID display, Internal Affairs. With a deep breath, he answered, his voice shaky. "Officer Whitman speaking." Just like that, the voice on the other end was cold and direct. "Officer Whitman, you are required to appear at headquarters tomorrow morning for an official hearing regarding the events of yesterday. You'll need to bring all relevant documentation and be prepared to provide a detailed account of your actions." Ryan's stomach churned as he mumbled a weak acknowledgement before hanging up. He placed the phone down, his hand trembling slightly, and looked back at Laura. She was still standing there, her arms crossed, her expression unwavering. "They've called you in, haven't they?" she said, more as a statement than a question. Ryan nodded silently. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air. Finally, Laura sighed and walked away, leaving Ryan alone with his thoughts. Across town, Mark Adams sat in his office, sifting through emails and messages of support pouring in from across the country. While he appreciated the encouragement, the overwhelming volume of similar stories shared by strangers weighed heavily on him. It was a stark reminder of how widespread the problem was. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, trying to process it all. His assistant knocked on the door and entered, holding a tablet. "Mr. Adams, CNN wants to schedule an interview for tomorrow evening. They're focusing on systemic racism in law enforcement and want your perspective. Should I confirm?" Mark exhaled and nodded. "Yes, let's do it. We need to keep the momentum going. The more people understand this issue, the harder it'll be for anyone to ignore." Meanwhile, Danny Hayes was sitting in his small apartment, staring blankly at his tablet. The headlines about the incident were everywhere, and each one seemed to pierce his conscience a little deeper. His family had called earlier, expressing their concerns and urging him to tread carefully. "You have a good career, Danny," his mother had said. "Don't do anything rash." But Danny couldn't shake the image of Mark Adams standing there, calm yet resolute, even in the face of blatant prejudice. He couldn't forget Hastings's sharp, piercing words, or the growing pit in his stomach as he stood by in silence. He had always believed himself to be one of the good guys, someone who upheld justice and fairness. Now he wasn't so sure. As the night deepened, Danny made a decision. He opened his laptop and began typing a letter to his supervisor. In it, he detailed his account of the incident, admitting his own hesitation and expressing his concerns about the culture within the department. It was a step toward accountability, but it also felt like stepping off a cliff. The next morning, the police department held a press conference. Director Hastings stood at the podium, flanked by other high-ranking officials. Her expression was stern, her tone measured but firm, as she addressed the gathered reporters. Yesterday's incident involving Officer Ryan Whitman and Attorney General Mark Adams is currently under thorough investigation, she began. Let me be clear. This department does not tolerate discrimination, abuse of power, or any behavior that undermines public trust. Accountability is not optional. It is a cornerstone of justice. The room buzzed with questions, but Hastings held up a hand to silence them. We are taking immediate steps to review our training programs, disciplinary policies, and community outreach efforts. This is not just about one officer. It's about addressing systemic issues that have persisted for far too long. As she spoke, Ryan sat in a small, sterile office within the department, waiting for his hearing to begin. The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. He glanced around the room, his eyes landing on a framed poster on the wall that read, "Integrity, Service, Accountability." The words felt like a cruel mockery. Finally, the door opened, and a stern-faced panel entered, led by Director Hastings. Ryan stood as they took their seats, his heart pounding. Hastings fixed him with a cold, unwavering gaze before speaking. "Officer Whitman, you're here to account for your actions during yesterday's incident. This hearing is not just about determining your culpability. It's about upholding the integrity of this department. Do you understand?" Ryan nodded, his voice barely audible. "Yes, ma'am." As the questioning began, Ryan found himself grappling with a mix of defensiveness and regret. He tried to explain his perspective, but each justification felt weaker under the scrutiny of the panel. The body camera footage played on a screen, the stark reality of his actions laid bare. Every word he had spoken, every gesture, every decision. It was all there, undeniable and damning. When it was over, Hastings leaned forward, her eyes boring into Ryan. "Your actions have not only jeopardized your career, but also the public's faith in this institution. We will deliberate on the appropriate disciplinary measures, but make no mistake, this department will not shield you from the consequences of your behavior." As Ryan left the room, he felt the weight of her words settle heavily on his shoulders. Outside, the protests continued, the voices of the crowd growing louder and more resolute. Signs bearing messages like "Justice for All" and "End Profiling" now filled the air, a visual representation of the growing demand for change. In the days that followed, the movement sparked by the incident gained momentum. Community leaders, activists, and even some lawmakers joined the call for reform. Town halls were organized, new policies were proposed, and the conversation around systemic racism in policing reached a new level of urgency. Mark Adams continued to use his platform to advocate for change, his words resonating with people from all walks of life. Danny, inspired by Mark's courage and Hastings's unwavering commitment to justice, found his own voice. He began speaking at community events, sharing his experiences, and calling for accountability within the system. For Ryan, the path forward was unclear. He had lost the respect of his peers, the trust of the public, and even the confidence of his family. But as he sat alone in his home, reflecting on the events that had brought him to this point, he realized that change wasn't just something he needed to witness. It was something he needed to embrace. Justice isn't about judging people based on appearances. It's about ensuring that everyone is treated equally. These were the words Ryan found himself speaking during a group discussion in the rehabilitation program. The members of the group listened attentively, with a few nodding in understanding. For Ryan, speaking those words felt like shedding a heavy burden he had carried for far too long. The act of acknowledging his truth, aloud and in front of others, was liberating. After completing the rehabilitation program, Ryan decided to take an even bolder step. He planned to offer a public apology to Mark Adams and the broader community. With a mix of anxiety and determination, he contacted a local media outlet to record a video message. In the video, he addressed his mistakes directly. "I want to extend my sincerest apologies to Attorney General Mark Adams and everyone hurt by my actions. I behaved wrongly and allowed my biases to cloud my judgment, but starting today, I am committed to change. I hope my story can serve as a lesson, not just for myself, but for everyone working within this system. We must do better, and I will do everything I can to contribute to positive change in the community." The video quickly gained attention, sparking a range of reactions. Some viewers remained skeptical of Ryan's sincerity, questioning his motives, while others praised him for taking accountability and striving to make amends. As Ryan left the recording studio, he felt lighter than he had in months. His past mistakes would always be part of his story, but he was determined they would not define him. He understood that change wasn't a destination but a journey, and his journey was only beginning. Months later, the events surrounding Ryan and Mark continued to ripple across the nation. Mark Adams had become a prominent figure in the fight for justice reform and police accountability. As Attorney General, he championed anti-discrimination legislation and advocated for improved oversight of law enforcement practices. His speeches, delivered with both passion and precision, resonated far beyond political circles. They inspired millions, particularly those from marginalized communities, who saw in Mark a leader unafraid to confront entrenched systems of inequality. Mark's work extended beyond rhetoric. He collaborated with nonprofits, legislators, and social activists to push forward initiatives aimed at transforming policing. These efforts included enhanced training to address unconscious biases, implementing transparent surveillance technologies in law enforcement interactions, and creating programs to rebuild trust between police and communities. Progress was slow, but Mark believed that even the smallest steps were vital in the larger struggle for justice. Meanwhile, Ryan Whitman dedicated himself to education and advocacy. After completing his rehabilitation program, he began traveling to schools, community centers, and police departments, sharing his story as a cautionary tale. "Don't let your biases guide you," he often said during his talks. "I made mistakes, but I believe mistakes can become opportunities to learn and grow." His vulnerability and willingness to confront his flaws resonated with many, especially young people eager to see a better future. One day, Mark received an invitation to a community event in Montgomery, a workshop focused on justice reform and fostering understanding between law enforcement and the public. Unbeknownst to him, Ryan had also been invited to participate as an ally in the educational initiatives. When Mark arrived at the event, he spotted Ryan speaking with a group of young attendees. Ryan's smile faltered slightly when he saw Mark approach, anxiety flickering across his face. "Good to see you, Attorney General Adams," Ryan said, his voice hesitant but earnest. "Thank you for coming." Mark nodded, his expression calm but serious. "Good to see you too, Ryan. I've heard you've been doing good work since we last met. Ryan lowered his gaze, his voice softening. I'm trying. I know I can't undo the past, but I hope what I'm doing now can help make amends. Mark paused, his tone measured and sincere. I received your apology, and I want you to know I accept it. But, he added, his gaze steady, you need to remember that this fight isn't over. Reform isn't a one-time event. It's a continuous journey. You've taken the first step, and I hope you'll keep moving forward. Ryan nodded, gratitude evident in his expression. I will. I promise. Mark smiled, the tension between them dissolving. Good, because we need everyone, even those who've made mistakes, to help build a better future. The workshop proved to be a resounding success, bringing together community leaders, police officers, and citizens in a spirit of collaboration. The stories shared, lessons exchanged, and ideas discussed left an indelible mark on all who attended. As the event concluded, Mark stood in the emptying auditorium, feeling a renewed sense of hope. The fight for justice and equality was far from over, but with each small step, the future seemed a little brighter. In another corner of the room, Ryan watched as the crowd dispersed. His heart swelled with determination. His past would always be a part of who he was, but it no longer defined him. He was committed to being part of the solution, ready to continue his journey toward redemption and change. The battle for justice and equality would go on, but now, these two men, once on opposing sides, stood united in their pursuit of a common goal: justice for all. Their story wasn't just about personal redemption and reconciliation. It symbolized the broader struggle to create a fairer, more compassionate society.